Welcome and settle in. Maren Aldwick was 23 years old and she was already very good at being invisible. In 2 years of service at Forbade Palace, she had taught herself to move through marble corridors like a fold of cold air, present without being noticed, finished with her work before anyone around her thought to look. Whether that invisibility was a kind of freedom or a kind of imprisonment, she had not yet decided. The question passed through her mind most mornings and never arrived anywhere it could settle. She stood now in the linen corridor before dawn, a stack of pressed pillowcases balanced in the crook of one arm, folding the last sheet with hands that were chapped at the knuckles and red from last night's washing. The corridor smelled of beeswax and damp wool, the particular smell of Cressfeld, which Maren had stopped noticing somewhere around the middle of her first winter there. The marble floor was cold through the soles of her shoes. It was always cold before the fires were lit, and the fires were not lit until after the linen was laid. This was simply the order of things, and Maren had long since made herself part of it. She worked without haste. Her back was straight. Her father had insisted on it, correcting her posture at the schoolroom table the same way he corrected his pupils, without sentiment. Posture is the body's first argument, he had told her once when she was perhaps 9 or 10 years of age. She had not understood it then. She understood it now. In a palace where no one looked at her, she carried herself as though someone always might. Her father, Aldwick the schoolmaster, had died 18 months ago, owing the crown a debt of record. The particulars of that debt were complicated and had not been explained to Maren, who was not invited into such complications. What she had understood, standing at the graveside in winter mud, with her mother beside her, was simpler than the law. The cottage at the edge of Aldwick village still required fuel in winter and flour in spring, and a roof that did not weep in the rain, and a daughter in service at a royal palace could send enough coin home each month to keep those things in order. That was the whole of Maren's arithmetic. It did not leave room for much else. She asked herself sometimes whether her father would have borrowed differently if he had known where the debt would land her, whether he would have sought a kinder creditor, or taught her something more useful than Latin declensions and the names of the winter constellations, which served no practical purpose whatsoever in a linen corridor. She never arrived at an answer. The dead do not revise their choices, and Maren had long since made peace with that particular truth. She paused. A loose thread had worked free from the hem of the topmost pillowcase, a small thing, barely visible in the dim corridor light, the kind of imperfection no chambermaid or royal guest would ever think to seek out and examine. No one would know it was there. No one would check. Maren tucked the thread back in with one careful thumb, smoothed the hem flat, and moved on without altering her pace. This was the nature of the work. You did it fully, or you did not do it at all. There was no comfortable measure halfway between that could satisfy a woman raised to believe that invisible things were still subject to judgment, still worthy of care. A rule of Cressfeld Palace, delivered to Maren in her first week of service by the head housekeeper, a small woman of grey dress and formidable stillness, and enforced without exception ever since. A linen maid must never be present when a royal door opens. You are like smoke, the housekeeper had told her, in a voice that left no room for questions and no warmth for reassurance. You are there, and then you are not. 2 years on, Maren had made herself precisely that. She knew every corridor by the particular sound of footsteps approaching from around a corner. She knew how far she could carry a stack of freshly pressed sheets before she needed to locate a service passage and step through it. She had never yet been caught standing still when she should have already vanished. She would not be caught this morning. The palace around her was still sleeping, its long cold halls holding the dark a little longer than the fields and the frozen river beyond the east gate. Maren Aldwych moved through the silence with the quiet certainty of someone who understood exactly how much time she had and intended to use it carefully. What she did not know, could not know, standing there with chapped hands and straight posture and a tucked thread and no expectations of any kind, was what the day was about to bring through the doors she had spent 2 years learning to avoid. The back passage of Cressfeld Palace was a place the great did not go. It ran behind the state rooms like a seam in a coat, necessary, invisible, smelling of tallow and cold stone. Maren Aldwych had walked it every morning of the past 2 winters, and she had never once encountered anyone who wore a sword. She had encountered undercooks and potboys and the occasional footman too proud to acknowledge her. She had encountered mice once in November behind the linen press near the east stair. She had not encountered a prince. She heard him before she saw him. Footsteps at that hour were not unusual. What was unusual was the pace. Servants moved with purpose, brisk and bent toward a task. These footsteps moved slowly, as a man moves when he's not going anywhere in particular, but cannot bear to stand still. She set her pace as she always did, soundless and deliberate, keeping to the inner wall. Maren shifted her armful of table linen and turned the corner by the east stair, and there he was. He was tall. That was the first thing she registered, a tall figure in an unadorned coat the colour of deep water, carrying no candle, moving through the grey pre-dawn dark as though he did not require one. The coat had no epaulette, no braid, no marking of station. She might have taken him for a steward or a secretary were it not for the quality of the cloth and the particular stillness of his bearing, the kind that belongs to men who have forgotten they are forever being bowed to. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the wall. And then Maren made the singular error of attempting to retreat and advance simultaneously. She stepped backward. She stepped forward. Her foot caught the hem of the first cloth, and the entire armful of freshly pressed table linen cascaded into the corridor with a sound like a flock of startled birds. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 3 seconds. It felt considerably longer. The tall man in the unadorned coat looked down at the linen. He looked at Maren. The candle nearest to him had guttered low, and the shadows across his face were uneven, as shadows will be at that hour in a cold passage. She had the impression of dark eyes, quietly attentive, and a face that had recently learned to keep whatever it felt from reaching its surface. "I beg your pardon," he said. His voice was low and even, and he said it as though he were the one who had collided with her, which in fairness he had not been. Maren opened her mouth. She intended to say something appropriate. Protocol required that she say nothing at all, that she sink into a curtsy and gather the linen and absent herself before she was truly seen. Instead, she heard herself say, "Please do not," and then she stopped, because he had already stooped. He gathered the nearest cloth with the unhurried economy of a man who had done useful things with his hands before, though not, she suspected, in corridors such as this one. He straightened and held the cloth out to her. She took it. Their fingers did not touch. The gap between them was perhaps the width of a prayer book, and yet it felt in that moment like the widest distance she had ever stood across. "You were coming from the linen room," he said. It was not quite a question. "Yes, She caught herself. She did not know, not with certainty, who he was. She knew only that she should not be speaking at all. "Yes," she said. He nodded, as though that were sufficient. He looked at the cloth remaining on the floor. "I think you have dropped another." She retrieved it. When she stood again, he had taken 2 steps back, giving her room that she had not asked for and that she was grateful for, in a way she could not have articulated. "The passage is cold," he said, and it seemed to her that he was not quite speaking to her, but not precisely speaking to himself either. "I had not thought about it. One does not when one has been walking a long while." She did not answer that. It did not seem to require an answer. She had no reply equal to it because there was something in his voice, some note worn smooth by long repetition, that made her think this was not the first morning he had walked the back passage of Cressfeld Palace alone, nor the 10th, nor the 20th. The court had been speaking of the Crown Prince for a year and a half. She had heard it from the upper housemaids and from the laundry women and once from the housekeeper herself, in a voice carefully drained of opinion. The younger prince had died, Prince Lev, the second son, the one who had, by all accounts, laughed easily and ridden well, and been the person the Crown Prince was seen to look for first when he entered a room. That was 18 months past. Since then, the court had waited for Casimir of Veldenmoor to resume his public duties, and he had declined, quietly and repeatedly, and walked instead. She understood now, at least in some small measure, what that walking was. She made her curtsy. She gathered the linen. She went past him toward the servants' stair, keeping her eyes down, and he did not call after her, and she did not look back. It was only at the bottom of the stair, in the warmer dark that smelled of ironing starch and the last of the night fires, that she realized she had left one cloth behind. She could picture it still, a long strip of white damask lying across the palm of a man who did not yet know her name. 2 mornings after the collision in the back passage, Maren Aldwych slipped into the East Portrait Gallery before the household woke. She had claimed the dusting from another maid, gently, without explanation, because the gallery was quiet and the paintings told stories she had not yet finished reading. She set her single candle on the mantel near the door. The flame steadied. The smell of old oil paint and cold stone rose around her, like something preserved from another century, and she was glad for it. The gallery held perhaps 30 portraits, arranged without vanity. The smaller ones hung where the daylight would not reach them until mid-morning. Maren moved along the wall with her cloth, touching each gilded frame, with a deliberateness she did not usually permit herself below stairs. She was not hurrying. No one would come. She stopped before a minor portrait near the far window, a woman in a pewter blue gown, painted with care but without grandeur, her hands folded at her waist as though she had been asked to hold still and had obliged. The handwritten label below the frame was small, the ink faded to the colour of rust. It told her very little. Maren leaned closer and read the words aloud just above a whisper, the way her father had taught her to fix a sentence in memory. Margravine of the Lower Reach, born 1724, painted 1741. She was 17 in the portrait. Her eyes were steady and a little sad, and she looked as though she had already decided something no one had yet thought to ask her. The painter had not flattered her. He had simply looked. The garden door opened. Maren did not move at first. The cold came in ahead of him, a winter gust that made the candle waver on the mantel, and then Crown Prince Casimir of Veldenmoor was standing in the doorway in a dark coat, without a valet, without ceremony, looking as a man looks when he has been walking alone for a long time and has arrived somewhere without meaning to. He saw her before she could become invisible. She stepped back from the portrait and kept the dusting cloth at her side. She attempted the small curtsy that protocol required of her, and very nearly managed it. He did not speak immediately. He looked past her at the portrait of the woman in the pewter blue gown, and something shifted in his face, not grief exactly, but the careful recognition of something old and private. "What do you know of her?" he asked. His voice was quiet, and he was genuinely asking. Maren looked at the portrait, then back at him. She was aware that she'd been reading aloud in a room she had believed to be empty. She answered before she could think better of it. "She was painted when she was 17, she said. "The painter gave her careful hands. I think she was composed by nature, not by instruction. Her gown is plain for a Margravine. Either she chose it herself, or no one thought to give her better." She heard her own words settle in the silence of the gallery, and wished, briefly, that she could collect them. "I beg your pardon," she said. "I was speaking to myself." "I asked," Casimir said, "because I wanted to know, not because it was permitted." He moved further into the room and stood beside the portrait as one stands beside something familiar. The early light was beginning at the high windows now, thin and grey, the colour of ice on still water, and it fell across the gilded frames and made them look like things that had been quietly waiting for a long time. "Her name is not on the label," he said. "It was removed. Her name was Annika." He said it the way one says a name that belongs to a particular and private room in one's memory. "She was my grandmother's grandmother. She married into Veldenmoor from the Lower Reach in 1743. The court considered her unremarkable. After she was gone, her estate was sorted, and they found a commonplace book written in 3 languages. No one had known." He was quiet a moment. Maren did not ask why he was telling her. It did not seem like the sort of moment that required a question. "I have not told anyone that before," he said. "I am not entirely certain why I tell you now." The candle on the mantel had burned lower through the hours Maren had spent in the gallery, and its light was thinning as the pale dawn gathered strength around it. The portrait of Annika held its place on the wall, steady and unpretending, her 17-year-old hands folded exactly as they had been folded for 85 years. Maren thought about a woman who had been called unremarkable, who had kept 3 languages in a book that no one found until after she was gone, and about what it meant for such a thing to be discovered only afterward. "Perhaps," she said carefully, "because this is the hour when the house is not listening." It was a presumption. She was aware of it as she said it. But Casimir looked at the portrait for a moment longer, and then he looked at her, and there was in his expression something that was not quite surprise, more like the recognition of a thing one had always known, arriving at last in a form one could see. He inclined his head. It was not a dismissal. It was the acknowledgment one gives when a thing has been said truly. Then he turned and went back through the garden door, and the cold came in once more as he left, and the candle straightened in its holder, and Maren stood alone in the east portrait gallery with the quiet and the fading light and Annika's steady eyes upon the room, and she did not move for a long time. The palace woke the same way every morning in the same order, as though it had been rehearsed for a century and could not be altered now. First came the clatter of the kitchen, iron against iron, the scrape of a heavy pot across stone, the low voice of someone calling out along the cold corridor below. Then, several minutes after, the bell from the stables, a single, clear note that travelled up through the winter air and arrived at the back staircase like a small announcement. Maren had learned to hear these sounds as a kind of clock. She knew, by the time the stable bell rang, that she had perhaps a quarter of an hour before the upper corridors grew busy, and the work of the day pressed itself against every quiet corner of Cressfeld Palace. It was in that quarter of an hour that she began to see him. Not every morning. At first it seemed like chance, twice in 1 week, then 3 times in a fortnight, and she told herself it was simply the nature of large houses, that their passages were mapped by habit as much as by necessity, and that 2 people who moved through the same corridor at the same early hour would simply meet. She told herself this for a while, then she stopped. He came down from the east wing always alone, without a lamp. She came up from the linen storeroom, a folded sheet across her arms, sometimes a candle in her hand, that cast a small and wavering circle onto the staircase wall. They would pause at the landing where the staircase turned, and there would be a moment, not quite a greeting, not quite a silence, in which something passed between them that the palace had no word for. He did not command. She did not curtsy and step aside. They simply stood, briefly, in the early dark, with the sounds of the kitchen below them and the cold of the stone floors rising through their shoes. And sometimes they spoke, and sometimes they did not. He had begun to speak to her about small things. The frost on the window glass of the east corridor, which had arranged itself into the shape of a fern he thought she might like to see before it melted. A book he had found misplaced on a wrong shelf, written in a language he could not identify, but whose illustrations were very fine. Once, a bird that had sat on the outer sill of the portrait gallery for 3 mornings in succession, as though it believed itself expected inside. He did not ask her to respond. He offered these things the way one offers a lamp to someone standing in the dark, without ceremony, without expectation of return. She began to understand in those weeks something about his grief. He never spoke of Prince Lev directly. The name did not pass his lips on the staircase, not once in all those mornings, but there were silences that meant him. She grew to recognize them. They were different from the silences that meant he was thinking, or that he had finished what he wished to say, or that he was watching the pale winter light move across a high window. These silences had a particular weight to them. They arrived without warning between one sentence and the next, and they lasted precisely as long as they needed to. And then they passed. She learned to wait inside them without speaking, and she believed he was aware of it, though he never said so. One morning, near the end of the 3rd week, he asked her a question she had not expected. He said, "If you were not here, if this were not where your life had settled, what would you do instead?" She considered this, not because she did not know the answer, but because she was not certain she had ever been asked it by someone who was genuinely waiting to hear. She smoothed the linen across her arm and said, "I would teach. My father was a schoolmaster in the village of Aldwick. He believed that a thing once understood became a thing owned and could not be taken away by circumstance. I think I believe that too." Casimir was still for a long moment. The stable bell rang its single note into the cold. Neither of them moved. Then he said, "What would you teach first?" She looked at him. In the low light, his face was quite serious, and she understood that he was not asking in the way that people sometimes ask such things without much interest in the answer. She said, "I would teach them to read slowly. Most people read too quickly and lose the weight of words before they have quite arrived." He said nothing after that, but his expression shifted, not into a smile exactly, something quieter and less certain than a smile. And she thought she understood that her answer had meant something to him that she could not quite trace. Neither of them spoke of their meetings as meetings. They did not arrange an hour or confirm a place. And yet, by the 4th week, it had become what it was, unmistakably, a small, private hour at the hinge of each morning, belonging to neither of them in any way the palace would have acknowledged, and yet belonging in some fashion to both of them entirely. The kitchen clattered below, the stable bell rang, the pale winter light moved slowly down the staircase wall, and they stood in it together, as they had stood many mornings now, in the quiet before the palace recalled what it was supposed to be. The throne room of Cressfeld Palace held its breath in winter. Gilded pilasters rose to a painted ceiling, allegories in blues and golds that no one had troubled to interpret in 2 generations. Candles burned in rows of 5 along each wall, and the heat they produced was not warmth but pressure, a sealed and golden weight, bearing down upon the assembled courtiers who stood in their formal ranks and murmured in careful cadences as the occasion required. The windows were curtained against the cold. The air inside did not move. Lady Rowena Fitch stood near the 2nd pilaster from the east door, as was her custom at minor assemblies. She was a woman of particular stillness, the kind that comes not from ease but from long practice in watching without being observed to do so. She had served 4 years at Cressfeld and understood its rhythms the way a physician understands a patient's breathing. Any departure from the pattern was worth noting. The Crown Prince entered through the side door at the 4th quarter hour. This was not unusual. What was unusual was his bearing. He moved through the assembled company with a composure that sat differently upon him than it had 2 months before. The grief that had hung about his shoulders since Prince Lev died was no longer visible in the same way. His posture had settled into something quieter, something more interior. Lady Rowena noted this. She filed it, as she filed most things without expression. She had seen him return from the direction of the East Service Wing. She had seen it twice in the past fortnight at hours with no obvious official purpose. She had not spoken of it. But she had begun to watch Maren Aldwick. The girl was not remarkable to look at, small and composed, her linen apron always straight, her dark hair pinned without excess. What was remarkable was her stillness. Lady Rowena recognised in Maren a quality she understood from her own early years at court, the particular discipline of a person who has learned to take up as little notice as possible while missing nothing of what passes around her. She did not yet know what she intended to do with this observation. She was a patient woman. She would wait. Lord Chamberlain Erwick Doyle was not a cruel man. He was meticulous, which in its own way is the more formidable quality, and the one that tends to outlast all others. He had devoted his working life to the preservation of Veldon Moor protocol, and he kept ledgers for everything. Correspondence schedules, precedence charts, the daily attendance records of the palace's staff. It was in reviewing the linen corridor access log for the month of December that he discovered the irregularity. A maid of the East Wing had been recorded in the North Passage 3 times within a single week, at hours that did not correspond with any authorized duty. He wrote her name in the margin with a small, careful mark. He did not raise the matter yet. He preferred to be certain before he spoke. Maren knew none of this. She was carrying her basket along the service passage on a Wednesday afternoon in the 3rd week of the month, thinking about the frost she had seen on the outer window of the east stairwell, a flowering of ice crystals along the lower pane, each branch perfect and complete. She had paused at that window before the others had stirred, and simply stood there looking, for the span of perhaps half a minute. She was still thinking of it when Lady Rowena stepped from the alcove at the passage's turning. "You are the Aldwick girl," Lady Rowena said. It was not a question. "I am, my lady." Lady Rowena regarded her with a gaze that was pleasant and exact. "And you find your duties in the East Wing satisfactory? The winter is hard on those corridors. The draughts, I understand, are considerable." Maren kept her basket steady. "I have found it manageable, my lady. The work is straightforward." "I am glad to hear it." Lady Rowena smiled, a small and controlled expression that travelled precisely as far as she intended it to travel, and no further. "You must come to me if you find yourself in any difficulty. The welfare of the household staff is very much a part of my charge." "You are very kind, my lady." "Not at all." She moved past, with a quiet rustle of wool, and the air in the passage barely shifted behind her. She did not look back. Maren stood still a moment after she had gone. Her face showed nothing, but she understood, with complete clarity, that the inquiry had not been about the drafts. Lady Rowena had come to take the measure of what she already suspected. The smile at the end had told her everything. A woman who had found nothing would have asked more. A woman who had found precisely what she came for had no need to press. Maren had not flinched, and she knew that this too had been noted. Maren walked on. She did not alter her pace. That same evening the library footman, a young man with a careful face and unhurried hands, appeared in the servants' hall with a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. He asked for the Aldwick girl by name and placed it into her hands without comment. There was no note inside. There was only a small book of botanical drawings, fine engraved plates of pressed flowers, each one labelled in an old, delicate hand. The pages were worn at the edges and smelled faintly of cedar. Maren understood at once that it was meant as a gift. She did not know whether he had considered what such a thing would mean to her. She held the book for a long time, standing at the window of the small room she shared with 2 other maids. The evening light, cold and pale against the glass. Then she placed it carefully at the bottom of her wooden box, beneath the letters her father had sent, where it would keep. Outside, the frost had already begun its work again upon the lower pane, each new crystal assembling itself in the dark. The kitchen garden lay in a pocket of stillness that the rest of Cressfeld Palace had forgotten to disturb. Maren had come at the half-hour when her work allowed a brief respite to gather her breath among the herb beds and the turned-over earth that smelled of rain and root. The lavender row ran along the south-facing wall, brown-tipped with winter, but still holding something the bees had found worth visiting on so unseasonably warm an afternoon. She could hear them, a low, unhurried humming that asked nothing of her. The bells of Cressfeld village had just rung the half-hour, their sound thin and clean across the frost-pale sky. She stood very still with her hands loose at her sides, which was something she rarely permitted herself indoors. She did not hear the gate at the far end open. She heard only the soft press of boots against the packed earth path, and then she turned, because something in the air shifted before she saw him. Crown Prince Casimir stood in the gateway with one hand on the iron post, as though he had not yet decided whether to enter. He saw her. He came anyway. He walked as men of his station walk, when no one they wish to impress is watching, without particular grace, with the ordinary weight of a man who is cold even on a warm day. He stopped a few feet from her, looked at the lavender row as if consulting it on some private matter, and said nothing for a long moment. The bees did not pause. "Forgive me," he said at last. "I did not know you were here." "Your Highness need not forgive anything," Maren said. "This is your garden." He looked at her then with an expression she had no word for, not apology, not warmth precisely, but something very close to recognition, as though he had found in her face a door he had not noticed before. He looked away. His voice, when it came, was quieter than she expected. "It was my brother's garden," he said. "Lev liked it because the scullery window opens on to this wall. He used to steal bread from the kitchen at supper and pass it through the window to the stable boys when the head cook had gone upstairs. The whole palace pretended not to know. I do not believe the palace ever truly knew." Maren looked at him. She pressed her lips together so that she would not laugh, and then she laughed anyway, quietly, only a little, a sound that surprised even her. "I beg your pardon," she said at once, but Casimir had turned toward her, and his expression had changed. Something in it had loosened. "No," he said, "please do not." They stood together in a moment in which neither spoke. The bees moved along the lavender row, a sparrow dropped from the garden wall and pecked at the cold earth, and departed again without ceremony. Maren thought of Lev, a prince who stole bread and gave it away, who understood that dignity and generosity are not always the same measure. She thought of her father. "My father was a schoolmaster in the village of Aldwick," she said. She did not know why she said it. It was simply what rose in her, the way a familiar word surfaces from sleep. He used to say that dignity and grief were the same cloth cut differently, that the man who bore one well bore both well, though he might not know it. Casimir was quiet. The bells of Cressfeld had been silent since the half-hour, and the garden felt very still around them. "Say that again," he said. She said it again, quietly, the way one repeats a prayer one has not spoken aloud in some years, but finds the words have not left entirely. The garden held the sound of it. He did not reply, and she did not require him to. After a moment he lifted his right hand and looked at it. On his fourth finger he wore a signet ring, dark gold, square-faced, the arms of Veldenmoor engraved into the stone. He drew it off and held it between two fingers, turning it slowly so the seal caught the thin winter light. She did not ask. He did not explain. He only looked at it the way a man looks at an object he has carried so long he has stopped seeing it clearly. Then he put it back on, pressing it down with his thumb until it sat flush. Maren had watched. She looked away when he lowered his hand. The earth in the garden smelled of thaw, of something underneath beginning to come slowly awake. The herbs were bare along their lower stems, but not dead. She had handled enough linen to know the difference between cloth that was ruined and cloth that only needed more time. Neither of them spoke again for a while. He stood beside her, not close, not distant, simply present, the way the garden wall was present without requiring anything of her. She thought that if this were a scene from a novel, some speech would be needed to make the meaning plain. But this was only an afternoon in a kitchen garden, with bees in the lavender and the soil soft underfoot, and the village bells long since faded into the cold air. Something had shifted between them. Both of them felt it. Neither named it. And that, in its own unhurried way, was perhaps enough. The hothouse roses had been cut at dawn, their stems sealed in cold water and carried up by the head florist before the morning light reached the palace rooftops. By mid-afternoon the blue drawing-room smelled of forced blooms and beeswax, and every candlestick along the mantelpiece had been polished to a mirror finish. Fires burned in both hearths, though the afternoon was still young. Cressfeld Palace did not receive Lady Isadora Thorne the way it received ordinary guests. It rearranged itself. Maren moved along the far wall with an armful of white roses, replacing the arrangements that had grown too heavy overnight. It was work that required invisibility, and invisibility was the skill she had practiced longest. She kept her eyes on the water levels in the crystal vases and on the angle of each cut stem, and she did not look toward the door when it opened. But she heard the room change. There was a different quality to the silence that fell when Lady Isadora entered, not the hush of awe exactly, but something older and more relieved, the long exhalation of a house that had been holding its breath. Lady Isadora Thorne was 22 years of age, possessed of dark eyes and a complexion much praised by painters, and she was the daughter of the Duke of Almvear, whose lands bordered Veldenmoor to the north, and whose political alliance had been a matter of careful cultivation for 4 decades. She was impeccably bred. She was precisely aligned. She was, by every reasonable accounting, the answer the court had been waiting to give, and they gave it now with a quiet, collective relief, the way one exhales after holding the correct response for a long and anxious time. Queen Mother Adelinde received her with both hands extended, a gesture Maren had not seen Her Majesty offer before. Adelinde was not a cold woman, nor a cruel one. She loved her son with the steady, unsentimental devotion of a gardener who understands what a plant requires and will not be argued into withholding it. She had sat with Casimir through the worst of his grief for Prince Lev. She had allowed him his silences without pressing. The evening before Lady Isadora's arrival, she had taken Casimir aside in the small salon and told him only that their guest had come a great distance and deserved his full courtesy. He had given her the patient look. She had not pressed further, and when the proper season arrived she had written the letter that brought Lady Isadora North in a travelling carriage lined with grey velvet. She was not wrong about many things. She was not entirely wrong about this. She was only wrong about Maren. Maren trimmed a stem and settled it into the vase nearest the window. Across the room, Crown Prince Casimir stood at the centre of the reception, which was precisely where a crown prince was required to stand. He was dressed in the dark blue coat, with silver buttons cast in the shape of the Velden Moor seal, the one his valet had laid out that morning with particular care. He bowed over Lady Isadora's hand with a courtesy so complete it could not be faulted. He said something that made her laugh, and the court smiled to see it. He was courteous to everyone. Maren understood this thoroughly about him. She had watched him be courteous to the under-footmen, to the elderly ladies who lost their trains on the staircase, to the stable-master's young son who had wandered by pure accident into a formal supper. Courtesy was his native element, but his hands were clasped behind his back. Maren had learned this detail without meaning to, in the way one absorbs the quiet habits of a house one has served long enough. He held his hands, so only when he wished to be elsewhere. She had observed it twice in the portrait gallery and once in the receiving hall during a long address by the Lord Chamberlain. She saw it now across the room, and she returned her attention to the roses. She did not remain for the rest of the reception. When her work in the drawing-room was finished, she carried the discarded stems back through the servants' passage to the linen corridor, where the spare vases and the pressing baskets were stored. The narrow corridor smelled of cold stone and starch. A single oil lamp burned on the shelf above the pressing table. She was binding the stems into a bundle when she heard footsteps that did not belong to the linen corridor. He stopped the doorway. He did not come further in. In the dim light, his coat looked very dark, and his expression was the careful, considered one she had come to know. The face he wore when he had resolved to say something and was not yet entirely certain of the words. "I did not wish you to think," he said, "what I suspect the court is thinking." Maren set the bundle of stems down on the pressing table. "I do not presume to know what the court is thinking, Your Highness." "That is not what I meant," he said. The lamp made a small sound, the wick settling in its oil. Neither of them said what he did mean. He left before she could find a word to add, his footsteps retreating down the passage toward the warmth and the candlelight, and the room where Lady Isadora Thorne was waiting with her dark eyes and her 4 decades of careful cultivation. Maren stood for a moment with her hands resting on the pressing table, the cold stone floor beneath her feet, the scent of roses fading slowly into the familiar smell of starch. She gathered the stems. She carried them to the end of the corridor and set them outside for collection in the morning. Then she folded her hands and she went back to work. The summons arrived in the form of a note, folded once, slid beneath the door of the upper linen room before the morning fires were properly lit. It was written in Lord Chamberlain Doyle's careful hand. A discrepancy in the linen inventory required her attention. Would she attend him in the East Gallery at 2:30? Maren set the note beside a stack of pressed pillow covers and went about her morning as though it had contained nothing of consequence. The East Gallery was the coldest room in Cresfell Palace. This was not incidental. The room faced north and had not been redesigned since the reign of the old king, whose portrait hung above the fireplace at its far end. No fire had been laid that afternoon. The single window admitted a grey winter light, the kind that did not so much illuminate as suggest the presence of things, and the marble beneath Maren's feet was the colour of still water. She had been in this room before, on inventory rounds. She had never been invited. Lord Doyle was already there when she arrived. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, examining nothing in particular. His posture was the posture of a man who has inhabited positions of authority long enough that authority has ceased to feel like a posture and become instead a form of rest. He did not offer Maren a chair. She stood. She was accustomed to standing. His footsteps crossed the marble in measured intervals, each step placed as deliberately as a word chosen for a formal letter. He looked at her with the expression of a man who has an unpleasant task and intends to execute it with professionalism, which is the closest thing to mercy that formal men allow themselves. "I apologize for the short notice," he said. He meant it in the way a surgeon means it, sincerely, and without it changing what comes next. There was no discrepancy in the linen inventory. They both understood this. Maren folded her hands and waited. Doyle cleared his throat a single precise sound and began. "You will know that the court of Veldenmoor is governed by customs of considerable age. They are not arbitrary. They exist to preserve what has taken generations to establish." He paused. The grey window gave nothing away. "A servant cannot stand beside royalty. This is not a preference of mine nor of any particular person in this house. It is the law of Veldenmoor, and it has been so for longer than either of us has drawn breath." "What is it precisely that I have done, my lord?" Maren asked. Doyle looked at her, and for a moment something in his expression shifted. Not softened, exactly, but acknowledged in the manner of a man who knows he is delivering a hard verdict and does not take pleasure in the weight of it. "Nothing," he said. "That is rather the point." He let the word settle. "Your work has been without fault. Your conduct, in every regard, has been beyond reproach." He paused again. "Your continued presence in proximity to the Crown Prince constitutes an irregularity, not an action, an existence. You have done nothing. Your position in these corridors, the fact of your nearness, is the matter." Above the fireplace, the old king regarded the middle distance with painted patience. He had watched many conversations in this room. He looked as though none of them had surprised him, the way only men in portraits can be unmoved by anything at all. Maren heard Doyle very clearly. She understood every word. She found, standing there in the cold north light, with the marble beneath her feet, that understanding a thing clearly and bearing the weight of it are not the same act, and yet both had arrived at once. "I see," she said. "I thought you would." Doyle turned from her slightly, moved one measured step toward the window, and studied the grey afternoon sky as a man studies a page he already knows by heart. "You are not dismissed," he said. "I want you to understand that plainly. Cressfeld values your service. What is required is a reassignment." He turned back to face her. "The West Service Wing is in want of capable hands. You will report to Mrs. Ansteth there at dawn tomorrow." The West Service Wing, far from the Prince's private corridors, far from the upper passage and its particular morning light. far from early hours she had no business thinking of now, and she was determined not to think of them, and she did not. "Yes, my lord," Maren said. "The word I would use," Doyle said, with the deliberateness of a man who has considered his vocabulary with some care, "is redirected." Redirected. The word sat between them on the cold marble floor, like a stone placed very carefully by hands that did not wish to call it something else. There was one moment, one single moment, brief as the pause between one measure of music and the next, in which something crossed Maren's face. It was not grief. It was not the outward shape of grief. It was the expression of a person who has carried something carefully for a long time and understood, standing in a cold room under the eyes of a painted king, that the carrying is finished. Then her composure returned. It folded itself back into place around her, quiet and seamless, and only Maren knew what that returning had cost her, and she did not intend to show it to the room. "I will be ready at dawn, my lord," she said. Doyle nodded once. It was not the nod of a satisfied man. It was the nod of a man who wished, briefly and without display, that the answer had arrived in some other form on some other afternoon. He did not say so. He would not say so. His footsteps crossed the marble once more, unhurried, deliberate, each step its own careful interval. And then the door of the east gallery opened and closed, and Maren stood alone in the cold with the grey window and the portrait of the old king, who went on looking at nothing with the infinite patience of men who are painted and cannot leave. The candle had burned low by the time Maren rose. It stood in its brass collar on the narrow window-sill, and its flame bowed and righted itself in the cold draught that pressed beneath the service door. The room was very cold. The palace fires had not been lit, would not be lit for another hour at least, and the only warmth in the small space was the shallow heat given off by young Bess beneath her doubled blankets on the far cot. Bess slept with one arm flung out, her breathing even and unhurried. Maren did not wake her. She knelt and drew her personal box from beneath the bed. She set it on the floor and opened the lid. The hinges made no sound. She had done this twice before, once when she first arrived at Cressfeld, and once 18 months past, when word came that her father had died and she could not travel home and had needed, in the night, to hold something of his. Now she did it a third time, and she did not hurry herself. The botanical book went in first, the small book of engraved flowers the Crown Prince had sent her by the library footman, wrapped in brown paper, with no note. It was old. Its spine cracked, its pages foxed at the lower corners, but it had come from him, and so it was hers, and it went in first at the bottom. Then the spare dress, dark green wool, folded twice along the seams as her mother had taught her. Then her father's penknife, which she wrapped in a square of white linen, before placing it down so that it would not scratch the book's cover. Then her father's letters, all 7. She did not read them. She knew them by heart. She set them flat in the box and closed the lid. Below, the first kitchen bell rang, one single note, swallowed quickly by the stone corridors. Far beneath her feet, the palace was beginning to stir, a door somewhere, a step on a flagged floor, the distant scrape of a grate being cleared of its cold ash. Maren sat on the edge of her cot and rested her hands in her lap and looked at the guttering candle and at nothing else. She permitted herself to think of what she would not have. She was careful about the word she had chosen not to use, had not used even alone, even in the dark. She named other things in its place. She thought of the portrait gallery, the west corridor of the upper floor, where the winter light came in at a low angle in the mornings and struck the gilded frames and made the older paintings briefly luminous. She thought of the lavender row beside the east kitchen garden, cut back to its grey stems now, but still present, still itself, if one crouched near the soil. She thought of the back staircase at this hour, before the household found its voice, the quality of the quiet there, which was not the quiet of an empty place, but of a place holding its breath. She thought of these things one by one with the steady attention of a woman taking inventory. She understood, as she thought of them, that she did not mean them. A person of ordinary perception could follow the list and find what it ended at. She preferred not to follow it that far. She stood, put on her winter coat, and took up her good shoes. She set the box beneath her arm. She was about to go when a sound came from the outer door of the service wing, a knock, quiet, almost reluctant. It was not Doyle's footman. She knew his step, which was deliberate and unhurried, the step of a man at ease with his authority. This step had been quick, as though the person had walked fast against his own better inclination and then slowed at the last moment. She went to the door. The footman was young. He stood with his livery coat still half-buttoned at the wrist, and he held a folded paper, unembossed, unsealed. It was folded and tucked, the way a person tucks a note when there is no time for wax or ceremony. "Miss Aldwick," he said, and held it out. She took it. He did not speak again, and he did not meet her eyes. He had the look of a man who has been given a task and completed it and wants no further part in whatever comes after. She unfolded the paper. She read it once. It was brief. She did not read it a second time. She folded it again precisely along its existing crease and went back into the room and opened her box and laid the note flat on top of the botanical book and closed the lid. Her hands did not tremble. She noticed this and drew no conclusion from it. The footman was gone when she returned to the corridor. The passage stood empty. The candle at the service door burned almost to nothing. Below, the second bell rang. The fires would be going now, the lower maids already moving. Maren picked up her box. She had been directed to the west service wing. Lord Chamberlain Doyle had made this plain in the cold east gallery, in a tone that permitted no appeal, and she had listened and kept her face composed. The west service wing lay to her left. She knew Cressfeld well enough to find it blindfolded. She turned right, toward the main corridor, toward the low, uncertain sound of voices that had begun to gather there. The sound of people roused by something that was not the bell, something not yet named, gathering in the way that people gather when they sense that the morning has turned. The throne room of Cressfeld Palace held its cold in the way old stone holds cold, not as a temporary condition, but as its nature, the temperature of a place that had stood through many centuries and intended to stand through many more. The pale light of a winter morning fell through the high windows in long, thin columns, each one illuminating a narrow strip of the flagstone floor, a fold of someone's coat, the edge of a pillar, nothing more. The great chandeliers hung unlit above the assembly, their crystals dark and still. The breath of the assembled court rose in small white clouds and dispersed into the upper air, and below that constant quiet exhalation, the room was entirely silent, as throne rooms are silent before the formalities begin, weighted, attentive, ready to receive whatever the morning intended to bring. The Queen Mother, Adelinde, sat in her chair to the left of the dais, her hands folded in the lap of her dark gown. Her face held the expression she wore for morning audiences, present, composed, and revealing nothing that she did not choose to reveal. Lord Chamberlain Doyle stood at his customary place near the eastern pillar, his posture the posture of a man whose life had been arranged around the principle that institutions outlast the ambitions of individuals. Lady Isadora Thorne was present, as she was present at all formal gatherings of this kind, her bearing without flaw, her attention arranged precisely where it would be most observed. Minor nobility occupied the space between, gathered in their accustomed clusters, speaking in the low undertone that morning permitted before the proceedings began. It was a routine affair. It ran by its own gravity, as routine affairs do, and the gravity of it assumed the morning would continue, as mornings had continued before it. Then Casimir walked through the main doors. He did not pause at the threshold. A man who pauses at a threshold invites the room to read hesitation into the gesture, and Casimir had not come this morning to be read in that way. He had come to speak. He walked the length of the throne room at the pace of a man who has made a decision in the dark hours before dawn, and arrived, by morning, at the far side of uncertainty. His footsteps made no sound on the carpet. The silence of the room absorbed them, and in their absence the silence grew more complete, as silences do when something within them has changed. He took his place at the front of the room, near the dais, and he turned to face the assembly. For a moment he said nothing. He let the stillness settle. The pale, cold light caught the planes of his face, the particular steadiness of a man who has lived inside grief for 18 months and arrived at last at a resolution that does not tremble. His expression was not stern and it was not anxious. It was composed in the way grief composes a person after sufficient time into something quieter than sorrow and more permanent than anger. Lord Chamberlain Doyle. His voice carried the full length of the room without any appearance of effort, the formal carrying voice of a prince addressing a public assembly, the voice he had learned in childhood and used for proclamations and observances and all the occasions that required him to fill a space with sound and authority. I should be grateful if you would bring the linen maid Maren Aldwick to this room, from wherever she has been directed this morning. The words were perfectly ordinary in their construction. Their weight was not. The court stilled. It was not shock. The assembled company of Cressfeld's morning audience were not a people given to shock, which required an openness to surprise that court life did not as a rule cultivate. It was the stillness of complete attention, of every person in the room performing, swiftly and quietly, the arithmetic of implication, a prince, a formal address, the assembled morning audience, a linen maid named by name, to be brought to the throne room. The calculation ran quickly through every mind present and arrived, in every mind, at the same conclusion. Doyle did not move immediately. This, too, was a kind of speech. Doyle had occupied his position for a very long time, by mastering precisely what could be communicated by intervals, by the management of silence, the eloquence of delay. He stood at his pillar, and the pause itself was a question, and the question was whether the prince truly understood what he was asking, and whether, understanding it, he meant to persist in it. Casimir waited. He had learned to wait these 18 months. He had waited in the portrait gallery, and in the long corridors, and in all the rooms of the palace that had continued to require his presence, even as his attention had been quietly elsewhere. He had waited as a man waits when he believes he has no other choice, until the waiting exhausted at last the part of him that hoped something might change on its own. He was done with that. He had said so in the dark of his apartments to no one but the cold air, and the saying of it had been its own resolution. He stood now, and his silence held. The Queen Mother, Adelinda, spoke. "Casimir." Her voice was quiet and clear. She was not asking him to reconsider. She was asking him in the manner of a woman who loves her son and has watched him for 18 months and understands more than she has ever said aloud what he intended. "I intend," Casimir said, in the same carrying voice, "to stop redirecting." The room was still. Adelinda looked at him. She was immovable, as she had always been immovable by nature and by long practice. She looked at her son, and something in her expression, very small, shifted in the way that love shifts when it recognizes itself in a choice it did not expect. Then she turned her head and nodded once to Lord Chamberlain Doyle. The throne room of Cressfeld Palace held its winter morning light like a cupped hand holds water, still, pale, faintly gold, where it touched the stone pillars. The fires had been lit at last. Their warmth moved through the great room in slow, deliberate currents, and the candles on the presentation table burned without moving, their light folding softly over the deep blue velvet, over the stand where the crown rested, over the pale marble floor that stretched the full length of the room like a frozen lake. Maren Aldwych came in through the eastern door. She did not set her box down. She carried it against her chest as she had carried it through the corridor and down the stair, the weight of folded linens and one small botanical book balanced in her steady arms. She stopped at the far end of the room and looked across the width of the assembled court, across the rows of ministers and ladies and officers in their winter dress, across the long cold floor of pale marble, and she found Casimir's face at the other end of it. He was already looking at her. He had not moved from the place the previous hour had placed him, at the top of the room, and he stood with the patience of a man who has stopped calculating the cost of patience. The court had turned when the doors opened. She had felt their attention settle on her the way snow settles, quietly, completely, covering everything it touches without sound. Lord Doyle stood near the pillar to the left, his expression arranged in the neutral patience of a man who has decided events will resolve in his favour. Lady Isadora, somewhere behind him, did not move. The Queen Mother, Adelinda, sat very straight in the carved chair beside the dais, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze moving to Maren and resting there with the particular stillness of a woman who has not yet decided what she sees. Maren did not look away from Casimir. He stepped forward from the dais and walked to the presentation table. It stood just below the dais steps, draped in deep blue velvet, and on it rested the ceremonial crown of Velden Moor. Not the coronation crown, but the crown the princes of Velden Moor had worn at investitures for 300 years, its gold softened with age, its stones the pale blue of winter sky. Casimir lifted it from its stand. He held it in both hands a moment, looking at it as a man looks at something he has long thought about and has now decided upon. Then he walked the length of the room. The court did not breathe. The only sound was his footsteps on the marble floor, even and unhurried, the faint shift of fabric as the rows of courtiers turned slowly to follow his passage. He walked past Doyle, he walked past Isadora. He walked past the great windows where the frost still lay in patterns on the lower panes, and the morning light came through the clear glass above them, pale and unwavering. He walked the full width of all those watching eyes, and he did not glance aside once, and he stopped before Maren at the eastern end of the room, where the light fell cold across the floor between them. He looked at her the way he had looked at her in the portrait gallery, in the back passage, by the garden wall, as though she were the one fixed point in a room that had been slowly tilting. "I was told," he said, "that you cannot stand beside royalty." His voice was quiet. He was not speaking to the court. "I have thought for some weeks," he said, "of an adequate response to that. I have not found one." He paused. "Except this." He held out the ceremonial crown of Velden Moor, and he set it into her 2 hands. Maren felt the weight of it, cool metal, old gold, heavier than she had imagined and lighter than the box she still held against her chest. Her hands were steady. They had always been steady. It was the one thing she had always known about herself, through every corridor she had walked and every room she had entered uninvited by expectation. She held the crown, and she did not flinch, and she did not look away from his face. The room did not breathe. Somewhere in the great fireplace behind the dais, coals shifted in their grate. The sound moved through the hall and was swallowed by the silence, and the silence was complete. The Queen Mother Adelinde looked at her then, truly looked, the way one looks when one has decided to set aside what one expected to see and to look only at what is actually there. She saw a young woman of 23 standing at the far end of the throne room of Cressfeld Palace in her plain working dress, holding a carved wooden box of folded linens against her chest and a ceremonial crown of 300 years in her hands, and her face was entirely calm. Adelinde rose from her chair. She stood very straight, and she inclined her head, a small formal bow, precise and deliberate, the kind given not from deference but from recognition, the kind that cannot be taken back. One by one, in the silence, the court followed. A rustle of fabric, a slow collective inclination like wheat bending in a field when the wind changes direction and the whole field moves at once and does not question it. Lord Doyle was among the last. He bowed. Maren looked at the crown in her hands, then she looked at Casimir, and she held the crown back out to him. "It is yours," she said. Her voice was steady too. "I am not taking it, I am only standing here." He took it from her carefully, his fingers brushing hers. He looked at her for a long moment in the pale winter light, with the fires burning behind him, and the court still held in its long collective breath. "That," he said, "is precisely enough." At the bottom of Maren's box, below the last of the folded linens, the small botanical book lay where she had placed it before dawn. Its cover soft with handling, its pressed lavender still faintly sweet against the paper. Beyond the long frosted windows, the lavender row in the kitchen garden was buried under the winter's snow, grey and quiet, and waiting for the warmth that would in time return to it. The fires that had been lit at last would not go out again. The light in Cressfeld Palace that morning had the quality that light carries when something has shifted, gentle, arriving, filling in slowly the way warmth fills a room when the fires are finally lit, when the cold of the long night has gone, when the windows hold the world outside and the fires hold the world within, and there is, at last, nowhere left to be redirected.